Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. It has been exceptionally mild recently, record-breaking temperatures in places, but things are now changing. So does that set the theme for the next 2 weeks or not? I'll start with the view across Europe and the North Atlantic. The animation runs from 18 GMT, Tuesday the 15th. At the outset, it's an unsettled picture. High pressure over continental Europe has pulled away, and we now have an Atlantic flow once more covering all parts of the UK. Outbreaks of rain there just clearing from the northeast. Now, as I run this through the coming days, very little changes. Further wet and windy periods affecting all regions, some drier interludes, and possibly one coinciding with Saturday. Uncertainty, of course, about the exact details at this range, but it leads to the chance of a rather cold start to the day, but brighter conditions at least through the morning and the afternoon. I'll look at that a little bit later. But the respite is temporary. More wet and windy weather pushes in from the west, and that really sets the theme for the early part of next week. The white shading there over the Scottish Highlands at times is indicating the possibility of sleet or snow. Very much what would be expected during the middle part of November. Nothing out of the ordinary at all. But there are some indications of the potential, at least, for it to turn colder. They weren't really clear on the last animation because that was very much focused on the weather down at the ground level, so precipitation, surface level pressure. But this sequence shows things further up in the atmosphere, and it's really looking at pressure forecasts from the GFS. Yellow shading is an indicator of higher pressure areas, and blues and greens lower pressure. Immediately, therefore, what's clear is there's high pressure blocking over Scandinavia, which can often bring very cold weather towards the UK during the winter months. If it starts to cut off the Atlantic flow, winds blow from the east across continental Europe into the UK. Is there any chance of that happening here? Well, let's run the sequence, because what this GFS run does is gradually erode that high pressure block to the north and east. As we head through the weekend and into next week, it pulls away, and things really get going with weather systems pushing in from the west into the UK and into the Low Countries, Germany as well. So if the GFS is correct, that high pressure block to the northeast is an interesting feature, but it really just flirts with the UK, Western Europe, and then it starts to retreat as the Atlantic flow becomes more dominant once again. But there are some differences between the various computer model runs, and I'll look at those in a moment. But if the GFS is correct, what does it mean in terms of the temperatures which we can expect in the UK through the first week? Maximums here for Wednesday the 16th, 10s, 11s, 12s in the south, cooler or colder, I should really say, at this time of the year as we head northwards. Much more typical than has been the case recently. Jumping forwards to Friday afternoon, and now, if anything, it's a little bit colder. Single figures possible maximums in parts of southern and central regions. I suspect if that is the case, if it's right, it will be the first day of the autumn that many places in southern and central Britain have kept temperatures down into single figures. But it looks quite marginal there. If it doesn't happen on Saturday, it may happen later in the week, but this is showing forecast minimums on Saturday morning. And as I mentioned on the animation, this coincides with a drier period between weather systems moving in, possibly a clear night therefore on Friday, and if it happens, temperatures widely dipping down into low single figures. A ground frost over much of the UK is very possible, and just a chance even in the southern half of the UK, but some places would be recording an air frost. I don't know how many locations in southern Britain have yet to record an air frost this autumn, but certainly I've not seen one here in the Chilterns in Berkhamsted. Now, moving forwards to the afternoon, 8s, 9s in the south, colder there again in the north. Often these low values which you see on the GFS charts are very much focused on the Scottish mountains. So because of the resolution of these charts, it can be a little bit deceptive. So much of Scotland will be seeing higher values than 2 or 3 Celsius. As I say, though, that's really over the mountains. But nonetheless, a chilly day compared to what we've been seeing recently. And forwards to Tuesday, very little changes. If anything, temperatures may be down a fraction further. So, as I say, if this GFS run is correct, much of southern and central Britain may well record their first day this autumn when maximum values do not reach double figures. What an achievement that will be after the ongoing mild conditions which we have been experiencing. Through the first week as well, with that vigorous Atlantic flow, it will be windy at times. I'm not going to really pick out any particular days, but I'm just using this chart to illustrate the potential. The strongest winds here in western coastal counties, gales or severe gales, possibly there in the northeast as well, around the coasts there. I think that really sets the theme for the first week. Windy at times, but nothing really exceptional or worrying showing up in the models. It doesn't mean they'll be correct. It's always worth keeping an eye on the short range forecasts, but the gales and severe gales in particular seem to be mostly restricted to western and northern coastal counties. Rain through the first 5 days. Here are the aggregate charts from the European ECM model on the left, the American GFS on the right. All parts of the UK seeing some rain. The driest conditions, though, on both of these in central and eastern England. Moving forwards to the 0 to 10 days period, the totals have continued stacking up. Lots of orange shading appearing, but generally the highest values are in the north and the west of UK. I would expect, though, this is going to be quite a good period for starting to or continuing to replenish reservoir levels across the UK after the extremely dry summer which we experienced. Now, do the deterministic models agree with each other at the end of the first week? As I mentioned, there is that high pressure block over Scandinavia, and although the GFS has it pushing away, what do the others indicate will be happening? Well, here is the GFS, Tuesday the 22nd, the Atlantic there pushing in across the UK, the high pressure block to the north and the east starting to retreat. Here's a computer model run which I've not used before because it hasn't been available. It's the new version of the GFS model. It's one thing worth remembering with all of these global models which are run by the National Forecasting Centres is there are efforts ongoing all the time to improve them. So the physics which is used in them is upgraded, the computer code is refined and tweaked, and the amount of data which they use is also increased. So the theory being that progressively they become more accurate over the years, but when an upgrade to a model is implemented like this one here, as I say, this is shortly going to become the GFS operational run, the improvements these days tend to be quite marginal. All the big upgrades, so to speak, were made a number of years ago, and now, although the amount of computing power is continuing to increase immensely, the improvements from upgrade to upgrade tend to be small. Nonetheless, it's worth having a look, and there are differences between this, the new version of the GFS model, and the existing operational one. The high pressure block to the northeast is stronger here. Possibly it would be having more influence further down the line. It's not been shifted away eastwards. The Canadian model, well, high pressure there to the northeast, low pressure close to the UK, an unsettled scene. The German icon, a little bit different because the low pressures are sinking further southwards, leaving the UK closer to the possibility of pulling in some cold air from the east, from the northeast. The European ECM also has low pressure possibly sinking down into continental Europe there. maybe just leading to the chance of some colder air being pulled in on its northern side. Finally, the UK Met Office global high pressure sitting up there over Scandinavia, possibly extending further west once more, suggesting there is some chance of colder air being pulled at least into the northern half of the UK for a time. And just to look at that possibility in a little bit more detail, the two postage stamp charts, as they're called here, are from the UK Met Office MOGREPS G model. It's an ensemble, so what that means is it's run many times with the starting conditions altered slightly on each instance, just to help account for uncertainty in the initial state of the atmosphere, because it's not possible to have a complete picture of the atmosphere around the globe. There just isn't enough data available to push into these computer models. And what it's showing is, on the left chart, air mass temperatures in blue shading indicates cold air, green close to the average. On the right, the pressure patterns have been shown, and both of the charts are valid for Tuesday, the 22nd of November. What they indicate is that there is a chance of low pressure areas sinking further south, like a couple of those operational runs were highlighting. And if that happens, at least in the northern half of the UK, for a time, colder air from the east may be drawn in. Definitely something to keep an eye on as we head towards the end of the first week. It would lead to an increasing chance of sleet or snow starting to fall to lower levels in the northern half of the UK. But will that become established if it does happen at all, or will the second week bring another change? Will the Atlantic be coming back regardless of what happens there? Well, as ever, at this range, it is all about the trends and the possibilities, not the details. And I'll begin with the 16-day GEFS plot for London. Across the top, air mass temperatures close to the average for much of the period. The purple line, the ensemble mean, sticks near to the thick black line, the 30-year norm, although later on it climbs a little bit. And the reason for it to be pulled up is there are several runs bringing in very mild air close to the 10 Celsius level at about 5,500 feet over our heads. Those are the runs which are causing the ensemble mean to be pulled up, but also in there later on there are some which are rather cold, so quite an uncertain picture. In terms of rainfall, quite a few spikes through the first half of the week. Towards the end, though, the number of them is decreasing, suggesting an increasing chance of it turning drier. High pressure possibly having more of an influence. But where would it be building from? From the south or from the north, the northeast? I'll look at that in a moment, but just a quick view of the 2-meter temperature data table for London. Fairly consistent through this second week for light greens and yellows. Light greens 6 to 10 Celsius, yellows 11 to 15. Very typical, really. No sign of it being exceptionally mild, but nothing really cold either. Fairly run-of-the-mill. But after the October, which we had, and the beginning of November, it will feel a lot more seasonable than perhaps we've become accustomed to. Going up to Manchester to see what's going on in the northwest. A similar air temperature profile to London, a few runs there later on going for very mild or warm air returning, but they are still in a minority. The rainfall spikes across the bottom suggest there's an ongoing risk of wet conditions, perhaps towards the end, perhaps it's starting to turn dry, but the signal here is much less clear than it was on the London chart. I asked the question, where would high pressure be building from? Well, if these charts are correct for London and Manchester, the suggestion is that it would be from the southeast, from the south, because the London one's showing the drier conditions returning, and it's not at all clear that they would be reaching Manchester. The 2-meter temperature data table for Manchester, light greens dominate, an increasing amount of light yellow towards the end there, milder runs 11 to 15 Celsius, but once more, very typical for the time of year, no strong trend showing up. Glasgow, air mass temperatures again close to average, although later on there are also a few runs bringing in milder air, just towards the very end there from around the 28th onwards. The number of rain spikes across the bottom seems fairly consistent through the period. It's a wet week, I would suggest, all in all, but there will be day-to-day variations, of course. 2 metre temperatures for Glasgow. Light greens on this plot, there are more dark greens than there were on the other two. Those are the runs going for maximums of 1 to 5 Celsius, so as has been the case in recent weeks, colder as you head northwards. Very, very typical, as I frequently say, but it does sometimes get reversed. Nothing out of the ordinary, though. There is that suggestion towards the end of the first week, though, of more dark greens, and that just really reinforces the message I was talking about, which is that if low pressure dives a little bit further south, we could see some colder air being pulled across the northern half of the UK for a time. It doesn't look like it's going to be lasting, though. If the GEFS is correct, it will be pushed away back into continental Europe as the Atlantic becomes more dominant again. And just to reinforce that message, here is the 10-day GEFS mean surface level pressure plot. So Friday, the 25th of November, low pressure centred to the south of Iceland, high pressure over the Azores, a little bit weaker than is typical. So their high pressure may be to the northeast of the UK. It indicates the jet stream being a little bit further south than is typical. That could, of course, lead to the possibility of colder conditions. As I say, if the low pressure areas are diving southwards. In this instance, though, the focus to me at the moment seems to be on the likelihood of it being very wet through the first week and into the second week, because low pressure areas will be just moving that a little bit further south, hitting the UK smack bang centrally rather than tracking up to the northwest. Hence, plenty of rain and close to average temperatures rather than cold or mild. The ECM plot for the same time, it's a similar story. Low pressure, as I say, displaced a little bit further south than is typical. High pressure there to the north over Iceland, Greenland, perhaps coming into play. I think the suggestion from the ECM is a little bit more favourable if you're hoping for some cold weather, some genuinely cold weather, but all in all, it's also pointing towards unsettled rather than wintry conditions. Now, saying that, is there any sign of it turning properly cold? Here's the 16-day GEFS postage stamp plot. It's valid for Monday, the 28th of November. Each stamp is showing forecast pressure patterns across the UK from one of the runs of the ensemble model. The key takeaways here really are that oranges point towards higher pressure and greens lower pressure. A few of these runs are showing low pressure areas tracking across the southern half of the UK, but all in all, there is nothing particularly cold here. The chance of sleet or snow over the Scottish Highlands is very typical in late November, but as far as the southern half of the United Kingdom goes, there isn't really a great deal here which would point towards an early period of sleet, snow and wintry weather. It could change, but I think the focus at this stage is on unsettled weather during the next 2 weeks, just that hint of high pressure building up from the south towards the end. But to summarise that in a little bit more detail, week 1, unsettled with wet and windy periods in all regions, the chance of snow over the Scottish mountains, temperatures often close to the norm but possibly turning colder in the north later on as winds maybe go into an easterly direction for a time as low pressure slips southwards. But as I explained, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about how that will play out. And even if it does turn cold, it's unlikely to last into week 2. Therefore, the focus is wet and windy periods again, temperatures generally close to the norm, and perhaps towards the end of the second week, it begins to turn drier in the south, with high pressure having more influence. So, there we have it. Unsettled, wet and windy in all parts of the UK at times, temperatures often close to the average, perhaps colder in the north for a few days towards the end of the first week. Then the Atlantic really drives back through, at least that's what most of the computer models are indicating. No strong indications at this point of an early start to winter. Yes, I know there is that high pressure block over Scandinavia, which flirts with the UK, Western Europe, but the general view from the computer models is that will be eroded, pushed away eastwards. I'm also aware that there are some background signals which would support early cold snaps in the UK, but until the medium-range computer models start picking up on those, I'm going to stick with the data and say unsettled rules the roost for most of the next 2 weeks. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then as ever, please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thanks for watching now. Bye.